Hello again. In the previous screencast, we saw that the ArchivesSpace backend deals mainly in JSON. You give it a record in JSON format and it saves it, and when you ask for a record, you get it back in JSON format. We also saw that the backend expects your JSON data to adhere to certain rules. Some fields are required, some fields need to be a certain type, and in reality validation is even more complicated. Some fields contradict each other and can't both be present, others must appear together. And we didn't want every part of the system that touches JSON to have to worry about this stuff. So we encapsulate all of this JSON handling gumph in a special container class called the JSONModel. JSONModel captures all of the different validation rules for our different record types. It uses JSON schemas, as we saw previously, to declaratively specify which properties must be present and what they need to look like. For more complicated validations, it also makes use of custom Ruby code. And it uses these validations so that it can take a blob of untrusted JSON data, check it, discard the unrecognized bits, and then pass clean data to the rest of the system. To avoid wandering too far into the abstract, let's have a look at some examples. So in the previous screencast we created an accession and we initially tried to trick the backend by just giving it an empty JSON record, and we found out pretty quickly that an empty JSON record just doesn't cut it. Let's try the same thing as a JSON model. So each of the record types in the system has a corresponding JSON model class. We refer to them like this. So this is a class representing an accession record, a JSON model class. We can actually do .schema on this class and get back this big ugly schema document, and that's the same as the one we saw in the browser previously. So this is the JSON schema that provides some basic validations for this record. Let's try the same trick that we did before. So let's say create an instance of a JSON model accession, and we're going to create it from a hash, and we'll just give it an empty hash, which is analogous to an empty JSON record. And you can see that's thrown an exception, and the errors of that exception should look somewhat familiar. So the exception is complaining that we haven't given it an ID 0 and we haven't given it an accession date. And so the key thing here is that the exception is thrown by JSONModel is exactly what the backend was using to report the errors. So when we were giving the backend a blob of JSON data, it was attempting to load it into a JSON model exactly in the same way that we've just done. And the resulting error was the error thrown by the JSONModel class. So as before, we could try fixing that up. So if we say JSONModel from hash, we could say ID 0 is, now I've got to get my syntax right, anything, and accession date is, as before, 2001-01. And you can see it's happy with that, so that's now returned an instance of the accession JSON model. And so the key thing about JSON model is that you can give it a blob of data and it will check it and return an object, and if we stash that as a variable, we can round trip it back to JSON by doing obj to JSON, and you can see that this looks quite a lot like the JSON the backend was giving us before, and indeed it's exactly the same. So the front end takes data coming in from the user and loads it into a JSON model instance, and assuming that all checks out, it then sends that data to the backend, which again loads that data into a JSON model instance and does its own checking before saving it to the database. So although it's JSON data, raw JSON data being exchanged in transit, everything has been run through the JSON model layer at some point. One other trick we do with JSON model is we have this module called JSONModel client, and this is effectively an API for talking to the backend. So in the previous screencast we showed how you can just talk to the backend using standard curl, and as long as you provide the right headers and get your URLs right, then it all works. We didn't want the various components of the ArchivesSpace system to have to do all of their own HTTP handling and that sort of thing. So JSONModel client is a library that provides that sort of thing for you, and it works in a way quite similar to Active Record if you've used that, and it actually acts as a mix-in to the JSONModel class. So in the first screencast we created an accession, and I happen to remember that it was accession ID 1. So let's use the JSONModel client library to get that back again. So we can say, when we're talking to the JSONModel module, we can say set repository to 2. That's the ID of the repository we created initially. And we can also tell the JSONModel HTTP layer to use a backend session that we already have. And as luck would have it, I'm running in the same terminal that I used before, so I can pull my existing session straight out of the environment. And from now on, any request that the JSONModel client library makes is going to pass along that backend session with it, so we'll be authenticated as the admin user. And from there I can do a JSONModel accession, and I can start using the methods provided by the JSONModel client mixin. So if I do JSONModel accession find1, that's going to issue a GET request for the accession with ID 1. And because we happen to know that that's the one I created earlier, you can see we actually get back an instance of a JSON model for that accession. And I can store that on a variable just as I did before. And you'll see that the JSON model classes provide accessors for the different attributes. So I could say id 0 and I get back my foo. If I say accession date, I'll get back my 2001-01. And because we're using JSON model client, we can actually change this at this point. So we could say change the date to 2012-01-01, no problem there. We could save it. And that save actually issues a post request back to the backend and updates the document. So if I now do an JSON model accession find 1, you can see that the accession date that's been returned by this accession is updated to the 2012 one I just made. Finally, just to demonstrate the validation again, if I take this accession and I give it an ID 0 of nil, effectively removing that attribute, I can ask it for the list of exceptions. And you can see it reports in the same way as before that ID 0 is required but was missing. And this hasn't hit the backend. Because the JSON model class actually defines all of the validation rules, this can be done entirely locally. So this is just coming off the fact that we can check the schema.